To really wrap our heads around the massive scale of the 2026-2027 Union budget, you just need to consider this one staggering number, 53,47,315. That's the estimated total expenditure of the Indian government for the upcoming financial year, in crores. It is absolutely massive. We're talking about the financial lifeblood of one of the world's fastest-growing economies. But what does a number that large actually mean for the country, for the infrastructure, and most importantly, for the future?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to translate these astronomical national numbers into an accessible, household-style financial breakdown. We're going to strip away the complex political rhetoric and do what we do best. Look directly at the data, break down the strategy, and follow the rupee to see exactly how the government plans to earn and spend its money.
So here's the game plan for today. We've got 5 main parts: vision for Viksit Bharat, decoding the budget basics, tracking the income, mapping the expenditure, and finally, looking at the deficits and the bottom line. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. Vision for Viksit Bharat, the guiding philosophy. Under Article 112 of the Constitution, this annual financial statement sets the stage for India's steady march towards becoming a developed nation. Now, the entire budget is anchored by what the government outlines as the 3 kartavyas, or core duties. The first is to accelerate and sustain economic growth, essentially building resilience against volatile global dynamics. The second focuses on fulfilling people's aspirations and building capacity. And the third aligns with inclusive development, making sure that every family, community, and region actually has access to resources. It's basically a blueprint trying to marry high-level economic ambition with on-the-ground social inclusion.
And here is the crucial framing. The government describes this as a Yuva Shakti, or youth-driven budget. It reflects a stated resolve, a sankalp, to prioritize the poor, underprivileged, and disadvantaged sections of society. This really highlights the narrative the government wants to project, a tight balancing act between supercharging economic productivity and making sure the most vulnerable aren't left behind in the sprint toward development.
Moving on to Part 2, Budget Basics Decoded, Speaking the Language. Okay, before we dive headfirst into the heavy data, let's quickly decode some of the financial jargon so you can navigate these numbers like an absolute expert. First up, fiscal deficit. Just think of a fiscal deficit like putting necessary home renovations on a credit card, simply because your total yearly expenses are higher than your actual income. It's the total expenditure minus total receipts, excluding any money you had to borrow to make ends meet. Then we have the primary deficit. This is a fascinating metric because it shows us the actual current financial gap by stripping away the heavy burden of paying off old debts. If you take your fiscal deficit and subtract the interest payments you're making on previous borrowings, you get the primary deficit. It essentially asks the question, are we overspending on our current needs if we ignore the ghosts of budgets past?
Finally, there's the revenue deficit. Now, in personal finance, a revenue deficit is a massive red flag. Imagine having to take out a bank loan just to pay your daily grocery bills or your recurring monthly utility costs. In government terms, this is when total revenue expenditure, like salaries and running costs, exceeds total revenue receipts. It means the government literally isn't earning enough to cover its day-to-day operations.
This family tree ties all these concepts together perfectly. It shows how every single rupee branches out. On one side, we have receipts, money coming in, split into revenue and capital. On the other side, expenditure, money going out, also split into revenue and capital. Understanding this split is the master key to unlocking the entire budget because it separates the money used for just keeping the lights on from the money used to actually build the nation's future wealth. Which brings us to Part 3, Tracking the Income, where the money comes from. So, now that we speak the language, let's track the incoming cash flow. There's an incredibly stark difference in our national income. We rely heavily on tax revenues. Net tax revenue is projected at over 28.6 lakh crore rupees, estimated to grow by 7.2%. That completely dwarfs non-tax revenue, which sits at just over 6.6 lakh crore. Non-tax revenue, things like interest receipts and dividends from government companies, is roughly staying the same as the previous revised estimates. The heavy lifting is absolutely being done by taxes.
To put that into a micro perspective, let's look at the life cycle of a single rupee. A massive 24 paise of every single rupee earned by the central government actually comes from borrowings and other liabilities. Yeah, almost a quarter of the budget is funded by debt. On the tax side, income tax is a major driver, bringing in 21 paise, while corporation tax brings in 18 paise and GST brings in 15 paise. It really puts into perspective how reliant the government is on both direct taxes and borrowing to fund its ambitions.
All right, part 4, mapping the expenditure, where the money goes. With the income accounted for, let's shift to the outgoing cash flow. How exactly is the government planning to spend that record-breaking 53.47 lakh crore rupees? Well, it's not spread out evenly at all. It's highly concentrated. In fact, just the top 13 ministries account for a whopping 54% of all estimated government spending. More than half the budget is directed by just these key departments.
And when we break down those top players, the numbers are pretty eye-opening. The Ministry of Defense takes the lion's share at 7.84 lakh crore rupees, representing 15% of the total budget. This is followed by massive strategic infrastructure investments, 3.09 lakh crore for road transport and highways, and 2.81 lakh crore for railways. These three sectors alone tell a very clear story about the government's top priorities right now: national security and physical connectivity.
But to really grasp this spending strategy, it's absolutely crucial to compare these two categories: capital expenditure versus revenue expenditure. Capital expenditure builds long-term national wealth. It's the money spent on things like those roads, bridges, and machinery. And crucially, it's growing aggressively at an estimated 11.5%. On the flip side, revenue expenditure, which merely keeps the lights on by covering running costs, salaries, and past debts, is only growing by 6.6%. You can actually see this specific strategy playing out over time. The trend in capital expenditure from 2019 all the way to the 2027 projections shows a steady, steep upward trajectory, reaching an estimated effective capex of 17.1 lakh crore. This proves the government's long-term play, heavily increasing capital expenditure year over year to build the physical foundation required for future economic growth. They're essentially betting that laying down all this concrete and steel now is going to yield massive economic dividends down the road.
Finally, part 5, deficits and the bottom line, balancing the books.
Before we look at the final deficit, we have to assess how the government manages the gap between its ambitious, capex-heavy spending and its actual income. A crucial part of balancing the nation's books is cooperative federalism. The massive transfer of resources back to the states and union territories is budgeted to reach 26.21 lakh crore rupees in 2026-27. This includes tax devolution, grants, and notably 1.85 lakh crore allocated specifically to states as loans for their own capital expenditure. The central government is ensuring local governments have the funds required to drive regional development right in tandem with the national vision. So what does the hard data say about the bottom line? It reveals a tight fiscal consolidation plan. The revenue deficit is holding steady at 1.5% of GDP. Meanwhile, the government is slightly reducing the fiscal deficit target from 4.4% to 4.3% of GDP for 2026-27. But remember, because the overall budget is so remarkably large, even at 4.3%, the government will still require nearly 17 lakh crore rupees in borrowings just to bridge the gap this year. Which brings us to our final takeaway. The government is estimating a nominal GDP growth rate of 10%. They're aggressively pushing capital expenditure to build infrastructure, while simultaneously trying to slowly rein in the fiscal deficit. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you to ponder this final question. Will this delicate balancing act, massive infrastructure spending funded partly by sustained borrowing, alongside controlled deficits, truly serve as the blueprint that secures a prosperous, developed India, a Viksit Bharat? Thank you for joining us as we followed the rupee through the 2026-2027 Union budget.